Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NeoSystems Big Picture Cyber Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don, and welcome everyone to our continuing series of Cybersecurity Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions with my guest today, Malcolm Harkins. I do want to mention at the start that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Also on hand today, we have our sketchnote artist, Wade Forbes, who's making a visual record of the conversation, and we'll share that with the attendees after we finish up today. If you do have some questions, please do send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on federal government contractors, and that's primarily who we have in our audience here today. I'll start with the introduction of Malcolm Harkins. Malcolm is the Chief Security and Trust Officer at cyber intelligence firm Epiphany Systems. Malcolm has been a CISO mentor and a coach, as well as an advisor and board member to companies in the cybersecurity sector, building off a career as the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cymatic and Cylance, as well as being the Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Intel. Malcolm has a practitioner viewpoint on cybersecurity and looks at risk decision-making in a way that often challenges the status quo. Malcolm, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ed. Happy to be here.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about the implications of artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. But first, I'd like to see if we could get an update on your newest work. You joined Epiphany Systems just a little over a year ago, in fact, kind of coincidentally, I suppose, right after you were last a guest on this series. In the press release, when you joined Epiphany, you talked about a shift from vulnerability management to exploitability management and how that may change the risk acceptance behavior. The hashtag there is protect what's exploitable, which really adds a whole new dimension to the typical scan and patch cycle. So tell us a little bit about exploitability management and how that impacts our risk management decision-making.
Yeah, so again, for decades we've used the risk equation, risk as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence, right? And what I've experienced and what I've seen is this continual kind of whack-a-mole cycle that you had referred to with regard to patching and hygiene, which we can't get out of by and large, but people are drowning in where to focus. They're drowning in where to address the surface level aspects of their vulnerabilities, right? Those endpoints and devices and identities that are external facing. But that challenge and keeping up with all those things is missing in many ways the crux of where we can pinpoint risk and where we can address it. And so when I first started advising Epiphany Systems and they showed me what they had built, basically an evil Google Maps, starting with the oh shit moment, the material impact of a device, an application, a system, and working its way out, mapping the attack path from anything to that oh crap moment. It became apparent to me that with that capability, that automation, that orientation and decision-making capability, when you see the attack paths and what can be done about them, you can transform the risk equation away from vulnerability towards exploitability. And when you do that, you can actually quantify and see the real exposure and the material impact to the business. And in doing that, now I can go from the inside out to the surface and go, what are the 50 instances of Log4j as an example, instead of the several thousand that might exist that are in an attack path that I really need to address because it's going to cause a material impact. And then more importantly, the attack depth, not just the surface of the attack depth, once the adversary is in your environment, of the daisy chain of identities and devices and network segmentations and all that other stuff that they traverse through the environment that we typically don't look at, and then take action on how to break those, or if we can't break them, where to put eyes on glass to prioritize our SOC monitoring. So for me, in doing that, it really transforms then the discussion at the board, at the decision-making level, towards material impact to the business, because you can see how that material impact would manifest itself.
And recognizing that most people, nobody fixes all the vulnerabilities, right? Nobody has the time or resources or pace that's necessary to just be vulnerability free and run an operation that way. So you have some vulnerabilities hanging around. Hopefully, it's the non-exploitable ones. If you use
well, and which vulnerabilities are can you know with a level of certainty could have a material impact rather than the spray and pray of go patch everything. And I know a lot of people with Log4j, after a week of debate, discussion, information gathering, all that stuff, they said, screw it, we got to patch it all. Well, that's certainly one answer, but the impact and the burden of doing that is huge versus going, what are the 50 things that I need to worry about now? And then the other several hundred, I can deal with at a hygiene cycle that is non-disruptive to the business. Makes
sense. So let's move on to today's topic, artificial intelligence. So AI has really become ubiquitous, but like many things, it first caught hold on the demand generation side, like deciding which ads to place in our social media feeds. And that, in the security business, we're just starting to get really some solid AI at our disposal. What do you see as sort of the biggest contributions that AI is making to the security space right now?
Yeah, well, so let's break this down a little bit. There's a lot of folks, and I saw this even when I went to Silence back several years ago, who was the core kind of, in my opinion, the forefront of using artificial intelligence, machine learning to mitigate the execution of malicious code with its endpoint protection. But what we found and what I saw from many in the industry as Silence started to gain traction, the marketing machinery of all the data technology that was starting to see the market competition, they marketed that they had artificial intelligence and machine learning, which frankly wasn't the case. So you also have to be very careful of what I'll call marketed AI and ML versus what's really there, because there's a lot of things that are marketed that don't really do it. So, one, peel the onion on that and really make sure that machine learning, artificial intelligence exists and where it exists and how it's operating. Once you've done that, then I think you can get to some really strong specifics. The artificial intelligence and machine learning that is real in the security industry is making tremendous strides, not only in the effectiveness of control, but the efficiency of control. And so where appropriately applied, you're reducing a ton of manual effort that would have been in place, to just identify issues. Even I'll take Epiphany Systems. The machine learning that we use to automatically generate attack paths and all those recommendation engines. Yeah, you could go get an attack path in it down a different means, but it would mean throwing bodies at it. It would mean gathering a bunch of information from systems, which would take time, and it would be static. Once I built an attack path with all that effort, all the data gathering, all that stuff, which would take a few people several weeks, from my experience, if I walk back into Intel to generate one attack path, the machine learning does it automatically, and it does it across the entire enterprise, and it's continuous. So again, you get a leverage of efficiency, and in the case of endpoint protection or some of the other, what I'd say, active controls using machine learning, the efficacy tends to be higher.
So one of the things that separates AI from traditional programming is the notion that the algorithm, the decision rules are not designed overtly by a human. They're learned by the machine, right? So we talk about AI doing things that no human ever decided to do. And there's a notion that we might not have as tight a control as we might like. The AI learns all this from human behavior. We know to be filled with biases, some conscious, some not. So does AI have sort of an amplifying effect on the worst human biases?
Well, it can. I think we've certainly seen some of that play itself out over the past couple of years in the political scene, with the amplification of what I search, what I look at, what I like. People tend to gather data to affirm their point of view rather than inform their point of view. And when you have algorithms, when I'm doing searching and I'm on social media, that continue to affirm my biases, it amplifies it. I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen a growing polarity in society, and certainly from the political side of things. And I don't think it was per se intentional, but at the same time, you could argue it is, because if Malcolm likes certain things and Malcolm's going to click on ads that have a certain tendency when he's in a particular research mode, whether I'm buying goods or services or looking at the news, it's going to continue to amplify you down a path that you're already on. And again, on the one hand, that can be useful if it's in the consumer purchasing stuff and I'm looking for, a new boat. And I've already been searching and it starts gearing me towards things that I continue to look for. It makes me as a consumer more efficient to find the things I want. Again, that's useful on the one hand. For me, it's useful for the advertisers, it's useful for the sellers, but that same application in gathering news, looking at policy and the political nature of things also, again, can be detrimental.
So how do we establish sort of trust in AI, right? I mean, what are the mechanisms by which we say, all right, I don't fully understand this, I've taught it, but it's learning. How do I trust the outcome is trustworthy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So trust is a function for me. Step it up 100,000 foot. Trust is a function of two things: competence and character. Right. That's true of individuals. I think that's true of organizations. So you look at it and you go, okay, did the folks who created the artificial intelligence and machine learning, did they have the competence to create it? Well, on the one hand, they did, because the artificial intelligence machine learning is there. The next question for that kind of trust is the intent and integrity of that algorithm, and whether or not they thought about the potential biases that might be built into it. They thought about the privacy implications of it. They thought about the data scientists and how to negate the biases. So again, when I was back at Silence, what we did is we recognized that could occur, and we curated and had humans involved in the training of the machine learning. And then we would have different models that, for lack of a better description, we did death matches against to see which one had the highest efficacy and the best efficiency. Right. So we did comparative models to basically try and reduce false positives, reduce the malicious code execution, make the most efficiency in the control action. So because of that, and then even in the data science side, we put in place a code of conduct for them, because again, they're experimenting with things. And certainly as we started trying to figure out how we could use machine learning for identification of, is that Malcolm behind the keyboard? You're gathering information that has a lot of potential biometric and personal implications and stuff. So for me, to really trust the machine learning, you've got to have that level of transparency on the processes, the security development lifecycle, the privacy by design, the governance around the creation of it, and then the operations of it to really trust it.
So let me poke a little bit about how if we have the trust, basic trust, what are appropriate things for AI and what are not. So a lot of security today is driven by policies. One action is acceptable, another action is unacceptable or prohibited. And these policies are intended to guide human behavior. We know humans are not perfect at following the policy, but we have some understanding of that, what we can expect to drive with a policy and what we should drive with enforcement mechanisms, things that are not up to the user, right? Things that they can't ignore. So how does that relate to AI? Are there things that as we look at the use of AI in security, are there things that should be externally enforced rather than trusting a policy with respect to AI decisions? Meaning how much latitude we give the AI essentially to decide what's going to be allowed, what's not?
Yeah, I think it's contextual. So, and again, I'll take endpoint, determination of malicious, non-malicious. You want, to me, having that done from the machine learning itself makes sense, because the efficiency, effectiveness of control, particularly when the false positive rates are low and you've got all those other mechanisms in place. At the same time, would I want in some cases machine learning to make a life or death consequence? Let's take out a future scenario of autonomous driving, right? I hope that by the time I'm in my early 80s, mid 80s, I can have an autonomous vehicle that will, make it easier for my kids, make it easier for me to be mobile when I may not drive as well. But you can think of calculations in those future cars that could be preserve the passenger under certain circumstances that a collision could occur, preserve the driver, preserve others on the road, right? Those would be potentially very calculatable items that could be figured out. And the question becomes, one, who's creating those algorithms, what transparency are in them, again, all those things to know if they're done right. And then the other issue becomes the protection of those machine learning and artificial intelligence modules. How do we know that they're not susceptible to an integrity related issue? We've already seen in the past, even a couple of years ago, Microsoft had a chat bot that was out and they released it. It was public knowledge, but because of the people trying to game it and it was learning off of the interactions, you were getting hostile, inappropriate, discriminatory responses back because of people maliciously feeding the chatbot with things so that the chatbot would learn, so it would actually spit, in essence, inappropriate things back. So, again, you've really got to think about the context of these things and what decisions you're leaving to the machine and whether or not you feel comfortable leaving those decisions to the machine.
And I think, there's with the trade-off, you mentioned self-driving cars, the trade-off there is between humans making the decision and the machine making the decision. So things about preserving the people around you, preserving the driver, the passenger, these are decisions that humans make every day when they drive. And some humans do a perfectly terrible job of making those decisions. They might even have a drink or two before they drive, which makes them make even worse decisions, right?
Or it's an autonomic response that they panic and they overcorrect and they magnify what could have been a simple incident because their physical reactions and emotional reactions to a ball running down the street that they think a kid is coming, they jam on the brakes, they turn the steering wheel, all of a sudden they flip the car and they kill somebody on the sidewalk who was walking because they didn't understand situationally they could have just braked.
Right. And they can't do the math fast enough, basically. Right. Can't do the math fast enough to figure that out. So, but we're accepting of those things because we can't do any better. I mean, we, humans do what humans do. And so we understand human failings and we've come to accept it. But when we look at AI, I think we set the bar a little higher. And looking at self-driving cars, I've read some articles that said they need to be 10 times or possibly even 100 times better, safer than human-driven cars before people will trust them and find them to be acceptable, right? So it's not just, oh, it's better than a human. It's like, it's way better. Humans make a lot of mistakes. Is it reasonable for us to expect AI to be as good as humans, or do we really need it to be a lot better at making these important decisions before we trust it, deploy it, turn over those decisions?
Yeah, I think in some cases it needs to be a lot better to trust for some decisions. But again, context oriented. If I'm playing a game of chess, online or on a game, and there's machine learning on the other side, totally fine, right? The consequences of the machine learning and me playing a game against a machine completely different than, again, the machine that might be making some decisions in my car. But again, you could look at it and you go, there's ample evidence that, people are already comfortable with what I'll call assisted driving, right? In Teslas and other things. Heck, General Motors and in some of their recent cars, even the Cadillac one, shows hands off, right? So they're advertising hands off driving and they're showing somebody in an ad doing that. People are already doing it and trusting in it. There's, and what happens at times when that occurs, when somebody starts trusting it, they're supposed to pay attention. And what do? They start picking up their phone, they start eating, they start putting on their makeup, they start falling asleep, right? You go, okay, well, is that, so that automation creates a level of inattentiveness sometimes for the driver, right?
makes it worse, right? Potentially, right?
At the same time, it makes it worse. At the same time, it makes it better. You know, like we've got a card that has all the sensors and stuff like that. And I love the fact that it will alert me when I put on my left hand signal in my blind spot, because the sensor, it'll go beep, beep, beep. And you see the thing that, hey, there's something there. But I try and be an attentive driver. And so I think in some cases, if we leverage the automation in combination with a human doing things, we end up in a better spot. It's just when we blindly trust the automation or become lazy and expect it to do better than what it's capable of, we make a mess, right? Or if the automation itself is not ideal, right, for its task, it's not been vetted thoroughly, you have problems. You know, I look at my Intel time, huge amount of automation in the factories. And guess what? Safer for employees, higher yield, lower cost. Is it machine learning? I don't know if it is these days, but that automation created a huge amount of factory efficiency.
Got some audience questions on the security uses of AI. I'll throw out one I think right up your alley. Are we seeing an end to traditional antivirus and malware protections? So, you know, you talked about silence in your time there, and that really was bringing machine learning into the fold. I mean, have these other approaches been kind of written off at this point?
I would wish the answer to that would be yes. But I can tell you there are still many organizations who have dated DAT and definition and signature and behavioral based anti-malware protections. Those are inefficient, ineffective controls. They have been for years, but there's still plenty of people out there with them. And I'll, again, full transparency, compliance regimes also point you towards them. I experienced this at Silence, where some compliance regimes asked me as they were going through the auditing how often I updated my DAT and definition files. To some extent, the compliance regimes keep people using that stuff. And in other cases, people go, well, you know, it's the cost, the time, the ignorance that might exist in organizations that do it. Or worse, on the consumer side, those advanced machine learning based endpoint protections and other things don't really exist in the consumer market. And so even if we killed it off in the corporate market, we're still going to have a consumer issue at this point.
Yeah, those signature update requirements still in the the latest iteration that we're working under in the defense industrial base. They're kind of related questions. Since cyber criminals have been getting faster at zero-day exploits, will AI be one way we might keep up? I mean, I was listening to you talk about you're doing these sort of threat scenarios with AI to generate them, and I was wondering maybe the other side are the threat actors using AI to figure out ways to attack things. So are they getting faster? I'll rephrase the audience member's question. Do you think the criminals are using AI to get better at zero-day exploits? And yeah, are we keeping up?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So on the zero-day exploits, obviously those have grown, but if you really have a unique zero-day exploit, and let's just stay with the nation state side of things, are you really going to want to burn a zero-day when there's easy paths to still get into an organization? No, you're probably not. And I think on the attacker side, just slight variations, right? The easiest way to bypass the signatures, guess what? Slightly change the signature. Easiest way to get past a behavioral indicator, slightly change the behavior, right? So the bad guys have been using automation to make those quick alterations to continue to execute. Now, at the same time, I'm sure they're using some additional machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities to go, again, find vulnerabilities, find where they can make exploits happen in the wild. Because again, they're a business too. They need automation to lower their cost and increase their efficiency of action. So, the easiest way for them to do that instead of throwing bodies at it is through automation.
So one area that it seems to me that AI could help a lot of the security challenges is sort of behavioral discrimination, right? One of the big challenges in designing security systems is making the mechanism as transparent and friction-free as possible when there's good behavior, people doing their job, while still providing reliable detection and blocking of the bad behavior, right? So we don't want false positives, we don't want false negatives, put simply. AI provides a lot of benefits because it's able to detect subtle differences that we may not even know. We may not even know in advance how this bad behavior and good behavior are different, but maybe machine learning can figure that out. But there's risks, right? Bias, discrimination, things you talked about, trouble dealing with atypical users that by their nature aren't using the system in a same way as everyone else. So how do we balance those kind of downsides as we design security systems that look at specifically human behavior, actions that are going on to decide what's allowed, what's not?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's tricky, right? Because on the one hand, we need that to, again, speed up the detection, speed up the prevention of potentially a malicious actor. So again, my mouse movements, keystrokes, how long I hover on certain things on a web app and stuff like that, all those things can be used with machine learning to go, is that Malcolm? Is he behaving in a typical way, or is it somebody else, right? Now, on the one hand, that's useful so that you can differentiate, is it my wife on the keyboard who's logging in, or is it a kid or somebody got physical access that shouldn't have physical access and so therefore ends up on the system? Is it identities that got scraped and trying to log into a bank account, and there's some differences, so you go, okay, well, we don't think that's Malcolm. I think you could do things that you could step up authentication, you could do additional verification, so you can use all those things for really enhanced security. At the same time, there's inferences that you could make on that. Did Malcolm just have 3 glasses of wine before he started typing and getting on the website? And if so, well, is that an issue or not an issue? In one context, if it's, I'm on the job and I'm doing some things, that might be a concern that Malcolm might be impaired on the job. And so therefore, but that's a different action. That's a HR related issue, just like if I was a truck driver and I got impaired before I got behind the wheel of a car, or the truck for the delivery. But in the security context, if we have those behavioral things and we identify that we think it's Malcolm, but there's a difference. Well, again, is he impaired? 2, is he having a heart attack? Is he having a stroke? Is there a medical issue? Has he got Parkinson's now? There's all these inferences that you can start making that have a lot of potential positive sides, but also negative sides. Those are where I think the security team, the HR team, the ethics and compliance team within your organization needs to start figuring out, as we do those enhanced behavioral things, how do we handle the anomalies and what do we do with that information? Because the other aspect of it, again, there's privacy implications, there's implications for me as an employee, as a human being, or even if I'm a consumer and I'm logging into my retirement account. What do they do with that behavioral data, and what patterns are they developing? What other inferences are they making? And or are they selling some of that behavioral information, right? Am I now a part of the product, and beyond just gathering that to protect me, protect the bank and stuff like that, they're now trying to monetize that behavioral information. That's another thing that we need to consider, again, which gets back to the intent of the artificial intelligence and the limits around it, and the business reasons to gather it and use it.
So we're just about the end of our time. I want to ask kind of a wrap-up question here, and then we'll finish up for today. In the security realm, we often get away with compliance as an excuse for telling people they can't do things. There are rules and we must follow the rules. Obedience is kind of the order of the day. And the ethics behind those decisions are not very often called into question. But as we start, deploying AI and using AI as part of our security operations, there can be some pretty significant ethical consequences. So just maybe to wrap up today, what's your advice to security practitioners, designers, practitioners, in thinking about how to avoid those kind of risks, ethical concerns with how they're using AI?
Well, let's step back. For me, compliance should be the result of a good security program. Not you're starting with compliance and thinking you're going to get security, because they're two different. So if you start with the right security, have the right security construct, principles, controls, the byproduct should be compliance. But if we start with rules and compliance, we likely won't get security. Malcolm, strong personal opinion on that. I think that same thing then holds true on the ethical side of things. I tend to start with principles over policy. Principles are like a compass, and if you can train people on principles, they're going to be easier. They're going to be directionally correct. And then when they get on a slippery slope, they will start asking the policy and the rule-oriented questions. But how many people are going to remember a 150-page InfoSec policy document? Very few. How many are going to remember a 50-page set of privacy policies? Very few. Figure out what the 5, 10 principles are that map to the values of the organization and the ethical and social responsibilities of the organization. Have line of sight to all those, train people on that. They're going to make better decisions, which will lower risk. They'll make better decisions that'll be more ethically inclined. And then when they get to a slippery slope item, they should ask Mother May I, because they know that they're directionally correct, but they got to dig deeper. And that will, again, then bring in the policy and rule-oriented experts to help them.
Good insights, Malcolm. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for your time today. Thanks to the audience members for the great questions, as well as your time and attention. Thank you, Wade, for doing a sketch note of this talk today. Please join us for future cybersecurity town hall meetings. You should have those invites coming to you in email. If you don't have them there, please head to our website, neosystemscorp.com, where we have all of our future events posted. Thank you for your time and attention today.